Have you ever walked into a place, only to feel the eyes around you silently decide that you don't belong there before you even get the chance to speak? Have you ever found yourself in a moment where just because of your skin tone, the prejudices, way you dress, or simply your humble appearance, people treat you like an inconvenience, and then you wonder, if this happened to me, how would I respond? Today I want to share a story with you, a gentle yet deeply stinging twist of fate. A simple choice, yet one of the hardest we ever face. Stay calm, or let anger take the wheel. And hidden beneath it all is a truth no one expected. The man being insulted in front of everyone was actually the owner of that very airplane. But before we begin, let me ask you something honestly. If it were you, if your dignity was torn apart by someone's contempt, what would you do? If this story makes you think, don't forget to drop a like, share the video, and subscribe. Because stories about dignity, human worth, and kindness deserve to be heard. Now then, let's begin. That morning in Denver carried that familiar crisp chill you only ever feel in Colorado. The early sunlight wasn't harsh. It was gentle, just enough to turn the concrete outside the private terminal into a faint mirror, reflecting the quiet, practiced movements of the ground crew. In the distance, the AeroVance G700 was being prepped for the first flight of the day. The engines were still silent, but the soft clinks of maintenance tools and the low murmur of conversation filled the air with a calm rhythm, like the whole world was easing itself awake before a long day ahead. Amid that steady motion, Dr. Marcus Langston stepped out of a smoke-gray SUV, a tall black man with broad shoulders and a calm, thoughtful face. He dressed simply: a charcoal crewneck sweater, a light jacket, dark khakis, and a pair of leather shoes that had clearly seen years of use. Nothing about his appearance suggested he ran one of the fastest-growing aerospace tech companies in America. No expensive watch, no custom-tailored suit, no showy presence, just quiet composure and the softest hint of a smile. At the private AeroVance check-in desk, a staff member greeted him with that warm, polished tone only private terminal employees seem to master. "Good morning, sir. Wishing you a smooth flight." Marcus nodded. "Thank you. Hope you have a peaceful day." He didn't introduce himself, didn't reveal who he was. And it wasn't just modesty. Today was a test he had decided to conduct. For the past 6 months, AeroVance had received anonymous reports about uneven treatment among passengers. Some emails described snide comments about people's looks. Others mentioned that certain guests were brushed aside simply because they didn't look upscale enough. Marcus read every single line, and each one reopened an old wound he thought he had long outgrown. He had grown up in South Atlanta, where just walking into a convenience store meant people's eyes scanned you over, wondering if you were trouble. He had lived through years where every accomplishment of his was questioned. He had watched silence cost him ground, watched people try to push past him because they assumed he wouldn't push back. But he never let anger lead him. And today wouldn't be any different. This flight, no roles were announced. No introductions, no hierarchy. Marcus booked under the name Marcus L. Carter, the alias he used for internal blind audits. He wanted to see how the crew behaved when leadership wasn't watching. He wanted to know if the stories in those emails were real. More than that, he wanted to be sure AeroVance, the company he built from shaky beginnings, still carried the values he fought so hard to instill. Marcus walked slowly through the terminal. He liked observing the small things, the quiet chatter near the coffee station, 2 staff members laughing softly as they rechecked the passenger list, the rolling hum of a businessman briskly wheeling his suitcase down the... Life always tells its stories through sounds like that. He paused for a moment at the giant window. Outside, his G700 caught the early sunlight. He'd seen that jet hundreds of times, yet the sight always stirred a quiet pride, like a father watching his grown child succeed without needing applause. He breathed in. Today would be a long day, a day full of unknowns. A day he would need a clear mind, steady nerves, and above all, patience. Before stepping toward the jet bridge, Marcus remembered last night's conversation with Natalie Torres, his executive assistant, the one who'd walked through years of storms with him. "Marcus," she said over the phone, worry threaded through her voice, "are you sure you want to do this alone? If something happens..." He cut her off, calm and steady. "That's exactly why I need to be the one to see it. No one understands what it feels like to be misjudged more than I do." The morning air was filled with the scent of coffee and the soft hush unique to a private terminal. But inside Marcus, there was a strange feeling, light as a passing breeze yet persistent, a whisper that today, something would shift. He had no idea just how right that feeling was. Then he stepped onto the jet bridge and walked toward the aircraft door. The door opened. A middle-aged woman stood inside the entryway. Hair tightly pinned, eyes sharp, voice cool as steel. Captain Nora Graham. The moment their eyes met, the real story began. The morning in Denver still lingered in Marcus's mind as he stepped into the small receiving cabin leading up to the aircraft. But before we enter that moment of confrontation, we have to go back to the place that shaped the Marcus standing here today. Marcus Langston was born in South Atlanta, a neighborhood whose uneven streets still carried the scars of scorching summers and the kind of wet, heavy winters no one liked to remember. The small, dark brown wooden house where he grew up was still there, worn down but warm in its own way. Every evening he used to hear the freight trains rolling over the nearby tracks, the metal grinding in a dry, harsh tone, like life whispering a reminder nothing comes easy here. His father was an auto mechanic. His mother worked night shifts as a nurse. The house never lacked love, but it lacked plenty of other things: time, presence, stability. Every morning before school, Marcus would sit alone with a peanut butter sandwich by the window, watching the dusty financed cars drive by their wheels, spraying small clouds of grit into the air. There were mornings he'd show up to school, only to hear someone say, half joking, half cruel, "Marcus, who do you think you're gonna be? An engineer, a boss? Come on, look at you." Those words were like needles, never sharp enough to wound outright, but persistent, lingering, the kind of sting that stays with you long after it's said. And that quiet sting became the fuel for a promise Marcus made to himself. He would never let anyone decide his worth for him again. At 17, Marcus won a full STEM scholarship. At 22, he became a design engineer at a small aerospace firm. By 29, he was part of the team developing the first hybrid engine model that would later reshape private aviation. But success never erased prejudice. He remembered a meeting when he was 26. He had just presented a draft design optimizing aerodynamic airflow. One of the senior engineers, a loud man with gray-streaked hair, pushed the sketch aside and said, "Oh, not bad. Who helped you draw this?" "Your supervisor." Marcus remembered that moment with crystal clarity. His heart paused. His hand rested on the table but didn't shake. He simply offered a small smile and replied, "The idea is mine, but thank you for asking." That was the first time Marcus truly understood calmness can be sharper than anger. Later, the company went bankrupt. One late autumn night, Marcus sat alone in a tiny Seattle rental, listening to rain patter against the metal roof. It was a moment of reckoning: accept defeat, or build something new from nothing. He chose the second path. AeroVance began in what could barely be called an office, more like a renovated storage unit. 3 engineers, 1 folding table, a cheap whiteboard that blurred every time someone wiped it. But Marcus believed in the dream of an aviation tech company built on transparency, fairness, and respect. He often told his employees, "If a passenger ever feels small stepping onto our aircraft, then we've failed, no matter how powerful the engines are." Those words moved people. But over time, as AeroVance grew rapidly, Marcus knew even the best values could get lost in the noise. That was why he was on this morning flight, not as a CEO, but as a man determined to see the truth without authority shielding him from it. Marcus had one small weakness, yet it was also his greatest strength: he believed in people. He believed people could change even after mistakes. He believed a professional crew should treat every passenger with equal dignity, no matter how they looked or dressed. He believed a gentle reminder could often do more than a harsh command. But this morning, as he walked through the private terminal, something inside him tightened. Not fear, just a faint off-key note in an otherwise familiar song. Marcus tugged lightly at his sleeve and stepped into the main walkway. Natalie's words from the night before echoed in his mind. "Marcus, I worry. If they treat you wrong, you of all people, then that hurt won't be just yours. It'll reopen wounds for everyone who's ever felt the same." He answered, "Sometimes we have to accept a little pain just to see clearly where the problem is." Before reaching the jet bridge, Marcus paused at a small coffee counter. He ordered a hot Americano. Steam curled upward from the cup, fogging the glass panel in front of him. Through the haze he saw his own blurred reflection, a 44-year-old man, successful, influential, responsible for over 3,000 employees, yet still vulnerable, still capable of being wounded like the boy from South Atlanta. Whenever someone looked at him with quiet dismissal, he wondered, would today be peaceful? Or would it be one of those days where he'd need every ounce of calm he'd spent decades building? A boarding announcement sounded. "Flight AV 117 to Seattle is now boarding." Marcus took a sip, exhaled slowly. He stepped toward the jet bridge, leaving behind the scattered worries. He didn't know what waited ahead, but he knew he was steady enough to face it. The aircraft door opened, and that was where the real test began. Captain Nora Graham turned around, her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if she'd already decided the man standing before her didn't belong where he was. Just a single second, but enough for Marcus to feel every memory, every old wound, stir back to life like a bruise that never truly healed. The aircraft door opened with a soft click, that familiar sound of metal meeting pressure. But somehow that tiny noise felt like a quiet warning to Marcus, a sign that he was about to step into a space that wouldn't treat him gently. The entry cabin was narrow, washed in a warm yellow glow that bounced off the polished metal of the doorway. Standing there, shoulders squared, uniform crisp and rigid, nameplate gleaming under the lights, was Captain Nora Graham. She looked at Marcus with an expression that wasn't quite hostile, but definitely evaluating. The kind of look people reserve for deciding whether someone belongs or doesn't. For a brief moment Nora froze, not because she recognized Marcus, but because he didn't resemble the first-class passengers she was used to. A flicker of discomfort crossed her face. But just as quickly, professionalism snapped the door shut on that expression. "Sir," Nora said, her voice even cool, "this cabin is reserved for first-class passengers." "May I see your boarding pass?" Marcus offered a small, natural smile, something he always did when stepping into a situation that could tilt toward tension. "Of course," he replied, handing over his pass. Nora glanced at it for barely a second, just long enough to see the name Marcus L. Carter and seat 1A. But instead of stepping aside and welcoming him on board, her brow lifted subtly. "It seems there may be a mistake," she said, returning the pass. Her voice wasn't loud, but sharp enough to slice through the fragile air between them. "A mistake?" Marcus asked, still composed. "Yes," Nora answered. "This first-class section is a VIP cabin. Guests at that tier typically have verified priority profiles. I don't see your information on that list." The sentence didn't contain a single unnecessary word, but every word stung all the same. Marcus said nothing. The air dipped, and in that silence he heard echoes from his past, voices from childhood. "Pretty sure you've got the wrong door. This isn't really for you." He exhaled very softly, then held out the boarding pass again. "I believe my ticket is correct. I was assigned seat 1A. Nora didn't look at the pass. She looked at him. Her gaze searched him, his clothes, his shoes, his quiet demeanor, as if she were trying to determine whether he was rich enough, important enough, or simply someone who had slipped through by accident. In that moment, the first true spark of conflict ignited, not through their words, but through their eyes. Marcus took one step deeper into the cabin. Nora lifted an arm, firm but not forceful, blocking his path. "Sir, please wait. I need to verify this." Her tone carried the weight of someone guarding a precious boundary, wary of an unwelcome intruder. Marcus stopped. He could feel the shift in the room. A few first-class passengers, only several looked over. They didn't know what was happening. They just saw a man being questioned, and they watched him the way people watch someone attempting to enter a space they don't look like they belong in. One man in particular, a middle-aged passenger in a navy suit with a gleaming watch, narrowed his eyes. Harvey Collins. His hair was slicked back with gel, his smirk half-curved like a question mark dipped in arrogance. He looked Marcus up and down, then shot a glance at Nora, as if saying without words, "See, I told you." Harvey never spoke, but his eyes did plenty of talking. Marcus didn't want trouble. Situations like this, he'd been through them. Not 10 times, hundreds. He told Nora quietly, "It's all right. Do whatever you need to do." She nodded, tapping rapidly on her handheld device. A blue light blinked. She entered information, waited, then finally said, "I'm not finding any priority profile matching this name. Therefore, I must ask you to step aside for now." "Priority," Marcus repeated. "I just need to sit in the seat I paid for." Nora didn't answer his point. She simply repeated, colder this time, "We need to ensure there is no mix-up in the first-class cabin." The word mix-up pierced the air again. Marcus looked toward seat 1A, bathed in that gentle amber lighting. The smooth leather, the wide armrest, the elegant layout. A seat any luxury traveler would recognize immediately. A seat Marcus had personally overseen the comfort standards for during AeroVance's redesign 3 years earlier. A seat that belonged to him on this secret audit flight. And now somehow that same seat was the centerpiece of a vague judgment, a judgment he knew far too well. He remembered showing up to a crucial engineering meeting years ago, shirt worn thin because he couldn't afford anything better. A partner manager had asked, "Are you the actual engineer or did you come with someone?" That question, even after all these years, had never truly left him. Nora clicked into her radio. "Coleman, I need you to check the first-class passenger list immediately. I have a case that needs verification." Coleman's voice crackled from the other end. "Problem?" Nora glanced at Marcus before answering, "Yes. Doesn't appear to be a match." The phrase "doesn't appear to be a match" slipped into Marcus's ears like a cold winter draft. She gestured toward a narrow spot by the cabin wall. "Please step aside." Marcus complied. He didn't want to escalate anything, not with all those eyes watching. But inside, a quiet question pulsed. Why does it always unfold the same way? A technician passing through the jet bridge noticed the scene. He looked confused. He'd never seen Nora handle a guest like that. But like most people, he kept walking, saying nothing. Silence sometimes can cut deeper than words. Then Harvey Collins leaned just enough to murmur, soft but perfectly audible to Marcus, "First class really lowered their standards, huh? Anyone can walk in now." Nora heard it, and she said nothing. That, more than Harvey's words, was what truly unsettled Marcus. Not the insult, but the permission granted through silence. In that instant, Marcus wondered, should he reveal who he really was, or let them continue until the truth revealed itself? It was a difficult choice. If he spoke up now, their attitudes would flip instantly, but then he'd never learn how they treated passengers when no one important was watching. If he stayed silent, he'd have to endure this steady drip of disrespect. Marcus drew in a slow breath, the same kind he had practiced throughout a lifetime of facing prejudice. He chose silence. Not out of weakness, but because he wanted the truth unfiltered. Nora turned to him again, voice firmer than before. "You'll need to wait until we verify everything. If it's incorrect, we'll have to ask you to deplane." Marcus nodded once. "That's fine." He stood there, quiet, steady, while a storm swirled inside him. Pride, old wounds, logic, and that strange, practiced calm only someone who has lived through this far too many times can possess. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath. "And now." No one knew this was only the beginning, just a small ripple before the real wave arrived. In exactly 12 minutes, everything would flip upside down. But right now, Marcus was simply a modestly dressed passenger, being told to wait, asked to prove whether he was worthy of sitting in the seat he had already paid for. The cabin, normally quiet, now felt strange. Not loud, not chaotic, but filled with a silence so sharp it seemed louder than the faint rumble of the engines powering up outside. Marcus stood beside the cabin wall, boarding pass still in hand, eyes steady, not confrontational, just calm. Calm enough that a casual observer might think he was simply waiting for a friend. But anyone paying closer attention would notice something else in his expression, a small, lingering sadness, like a raindrop clinging to the window after a storm. Nora remained planted in the aisle, expression blank, blocking the way forward. She stared into her handheld device, as if diagnosing a critical system failure. But the truth was plain, she was looking for a pretext. Behind her, flight attendant Jenna Price appeared. She looked about 28, blonde hair pulled into a high ponytail, makeup done in the subtle, polished style cabin crews are trained for. Jenna flicked a quick glance toward Marcus, just a split-second look, but long enough for him to see the caution in her eyes. The slight suspicion, as if he might be a problem passenger. Jenna lowered her voice. "What's going on?" Captain Nora tilted her head toward Marcus without taking her eyes off him. "This case needs further verification. I don't see a priority profile for him." Jenna nodded as though everything made perfect sense. Then, almost casually, she entered a small symbol on her tablet. Marcus heard a tiny beep, barely audible, but he knew exactly what it meant. On AeroVance's internal system, that sound indicated a passenger of concern tag, marking someone for additional monitoring. It was used for people who caused disturbances, people who were intoxicated, or people whom the crew simply judged as not suitable, though no policy ever wrote that part down. Marcus had reviewed this system countless times in internal meetings. He never imagined it would be used on him. A small ripple moved through him, not anger but sorrow. Sorrow that some things he believed had changed, clearly had not. Nora continued in her strict procedural tone, every syllable crisp, precise, polished. "Sir, until I can confirm your identity in the VIP system, you cannot enter the first-class cabin," Marcus asked gently. "And if the system is malfunctioning," Nora replied instantly, "then we will still prioritize verified guests. We cannot risk an error." Marcus held her gaze. And in her eyes, he saw exactly what he feared most: bias, pretending it wasn't bias. The first-class passengers were growing restless now. A young woman in seat 3C leaned toward her husband and whispered, "What's happening?" Her husband shrugged. "Probably someone booked the wrong ticket. Happens all the time." From seat 2, a Harvey Collins let out a thin, amused chuckle, quiet but intentional enough for his row to hear. "First class is getting sloppy," he said openly. "People walk in who don't exactly look the part." That line wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration that Marcus didn't belong there. Jenna heard it. She glanced at Harvey, then at Marcus, but she said nothing. No one corrected the lie. And sometimes silence does more damage than any spoken word. Marcus inhaled, softly, standing tall. He didn't react, not because it didn't hurt, but because he knew anger wouldn't help him here. Inside, a part of him wanted to ask, "Why is it when you look at me, your first thought is that I can't possibly belong here?" But he held that question inside. He'd learned long ago that if he let emotion lead, people would use it against him. Just then, First Officer Daniel Coleman stepped out from the cockpit. Early 40s, solid build, the no-nonsense face of someone who'd flown American skies for decades. Coleman looked at Marcus for half a second, the same quick, categorizing look Nora had given him. "What's the issue, Captain?" he asked. Nora replied, "Passenger verification problem. I can't find him on the priority registry." Coleman turned to Marcus. His expression wasn't hostile, but it wasn't welcoming either. "Do you have a ticket?" he asked. not as a question but as a mild interrogation. Marcus held it out. "Here, seat 1A." Coleman stared at the boarding pass for a grand total of 3 seconds, then handed it back almost dismissively, as if simply looking at Marcus told him everything he needed to know. "Please wait right here," Coleman said, firm and final, "until we finish the verification procedure." Marcus asked, "I selected this seat, and my ticket is valid. Why am I not allowed to sit where I paid to sit?" Coleman answered without hesitation. "We need to ensure security and service standards. Please cooperate." Security, standards. Words that Marcus had heard many times, usually right before someone made a prejudice decision, sound official. From row 4, an older woman named Linda Harper rose slightly, speaking with genuine concern. "Excuse me, I think we're getting a little too tense. He hasn't done anything wrong." Nora turned toward Linda with a polite, tight smile. "Ma'am, this is an internal procedure. Thank you for your understanding." Linda sat, though her eyes stayed locked on Marcus' eyes that had clearly seen unfairness before and recognized it now. Meanwhile, Jenna tapped her tablet again, adding another note. Marcus caught the shift in color on her screen. His name turned a soft shade of yellow. He had seen that color-coded system many times. He never imagined seeing it next to his own name. "For this reason," Jenna whispered to Nora, "I've flagged him. If necessary, we can request security support." Marcus heard every word. His heartbeat didn't jump. His hands didn't shake. But something in his chest tightened, a small, steady knot. He thought, "This is exactly what I've been trying to change for years, and somehow it's still here." Then Harvey Collins chimed in again with that smug tone of self-assured superiority. "Honestly, I don't think this needs so much discussion. You can tell right away who does and doesn't belong up here." Marcus looked at him, not angry, not defeated. Just the look of a man who had heard that line too many times to still be surprised. Finally, Nora said, "Sir, we will be calling security to assist with the verification process. Until then, do not move. Do not move. Do not sit. Do not trust. Do not be trusted." A long list of commands that Marcus had endured since he was a boy in South Atlanta. He nodded softly. Not in agreement, but in observation. He was watching, studying, tracing the root of the problem back to where it lived. A wave of injustice was beginning to rise, and no one in that cabin knew that the quiet man they were dismissing, the man they were tagging, doubting, and pushing aside, was the one person with the authority to change the course of their entire future. No one knew. But they would, very, very soon. The air in the cabin had turned heavy, not because of shouting, not because of chaos, but because of those long stretches of silence stretched tight like a string on a guitar, just waiting for the slightest touch to make it tremble. Marcus stood by the cabin wall, his hand resting lightly on his boarding pass, his eyes fixed ahead while still catching every small movement from the crew. He didn't react, he didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice. His silence made the cabin feel even more tense, but it also made more people start paying attention. The looks began to change. Curiosity, confusion, and something else, a growing sense that something wasn't right. A group of passengers further back, people who had been quiet until now, started murmuring among themselves. Not loud, but enough to disrupt the illusion that everyone agreed Marcus didn't belong there. In row 5, a tall black man with a gentle but deep knowing face had been watching quietly from the beginning. The way he looked at Marcus was like seeing a reflection of his own younger self. His name was Calvin Rhodes, owner of a small logistics company in Memphis. He'd been through this kind of thing often, hotel staff asking if he was sure he had the right room, security guards shadowing him in stores, doubtful glances in meetings where he was the one signing the largest contract at the table. Calvin stood up. He didn't shout, didn't wave his arms, didn't explode with anger. He simply took a step forward and spoke in a calm, steady tone. "Excuse me, but I don't see that he's done anything wrong. If he has a first-class ticket, then what's the issue? Nora turned, frowning slightly. Sir, this is an internal procedure. We need to verify. Calvin looked at Marcus, then at Nora, with the eyes of a man who knew exactly what subtle discrimination looked like. I understand procedures, he said slowly. I also understand when procedures are being used as an excuse. From two, a Harvey Collins smirked. Oh, don't start turning this into some race thing, he scoffed. We're flying business, not hosting a town hall meeting. One sentence that dodged the truth, while proudly showing off his belief that he belonged to a higher tier. Calvin didn't look at Harvey. He kept his eyes on Marcus instead, as if to say, I'm with you. In row 3, a young Asian man with a quiet, studious look had been silent up to this point. Small black backpack, jeans, light jacket. His name was Evan Lee, a tech employee on his way to Seattle for a conference. Evan wasn't usually the type to jump into other people's problems, but he'd seen everything from Nora's first look to Coleman's baseless suspicion to Harvey's thinly veiled insult. Evan stood up, his voice a little shaky but firm. Excuse me. I also want to ask, is there any rule saying a first-class passenger has to look rich? The question sounded almost innocent, but it cracked the air like a hammer hitting ice. Flight attendant Jenna Price flushed. She stuttered, No one said that, sir. We only need verification because his name isn't on the priority list. Marcus gently replied to Evan, trying to keep the tension from rising further. It's all right. I'm okay. But Evan shook his head. No, it's not okay. You bought a ticket, you're standing in the right place, and you're being treated differently just because. He trailed off. He knew the reason. Everyone did. No one wanted to say it. Until Linda, the older woman in row 4, spoke softly. Because he's black. That's the reason, isn't it? Nora stiffened. Jenna froze. Coleman turned his face away. No one said a word. And in that silence, the answer was painfully clear. Marcus took a slow breath. He looked at Linda, then at Evan and Calvin. In his eyes there was gratitude, and also sadness, the sadness of a man who'd seen this story so many times he already knew how it usually went. He said quietly, Thank you, all of you. But I don't want this to turn into something bigger. I just want to sit in the seat I chose. Nora replied instantly, like a reflex. You cannot do that until verification is complete. Calvin asked. How long will that take? Coleman spoke slowly. Could be a few minutes. Could be longer, Linda responded immediately. I've flown this airline for 10 years. I've never seen them verify anyone for this long. No one argued. Suddenly, another passenger spoke up. A young man, maybe 22, with lightly curled hair and a small camera hanging from his neck. His name was Mason Clark, a media student. He raised his hand a little hesitantly. I've been recording since he boarded, he said quietly. There was nothing unusual. He just showed his ticket. He didn't cause any trouble. Nora shot Mason a sharp look. Sir, filming in the cabin is not permitted. Mason swallowed. I was just recording my travel vlog. But the video clearly shows he did nothing wrong. If needed, I can send it to the airline. Coleman frowned. You should be careful with what you say. Calvin stepped in, voice deep and grounded. No, he shouldn't be careful. He should be honest. And if the truth makes someone uncomfortable, then the problem isn't this young man. The cabin now felt split. On one side, the crew, the ones in control of the flight. On the other, the passengers, more and more of them, realizing they were witnessing something wrong. And in the middle, Marcus, standing in the eye of the storm, holding himself with the calm of someone who has walked through cold winds like this his whole life. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3. No one moved, no one spoke. The silence grew so thick it felt like you could hear the person next to you breathing. Jenna checked her tablet again. Her eyes wavered. Whether it was confusion, guilt, or simple doubt, it was clear she no longer felt as certain as before. Captain, Jenna murmured, voice dropping. I think maybe the system really is glitching. Nora snapped her head around as if that sentence itself were an act of betrayal. "The system is not wrong," Nora said sharply. "The system was built to protect our standards." Marcus looked up. "Sometimes the system reflects our standards," he said softly. "And sometimes it reflects the bias of the people running it." His words were gentle, but inside them was a lifetime of experience. Nora went quiet for a second, just a second, but it was enough to see that his words had landed. Then she straightened again, wrapping herself back in authority. "I'll call security to assist," Nora announced. "If you cannot prove you're a priority passenger, you'll have to leave the plane." Evan blurted out, "He has a ticket, he doesn't need to prove anything else." Linda stood as well. "No one should have to prove they're fancy enough to sit in the seat they paid for." Harvey groaned, annoyed. "Oh, for God's sake, just let them do their jobs. You people are the ones delaying the flight." Calvin turned to Harvey and answered, calm but firm, "No. We're stopping a mistake from happening." Marcus remained still. No arguing, no shoving back, no resistance. He simply looked at Nora and said, "If you truly believe this is standard procedure, I'll wait. But I hope you really believe that." His words weren't harsh, weren't insulting, but they struck the cabin like a quiet thunderclap. Outside, the wind whistled faintly over the runway. The smell of fuel drifted into the cabin. Every ordinary sound suddenly felt like background music to a moment that was anything but ordinary. No one in that cabin realized they were standing in the middle of a scene that would be talked about for a very long time, and none of them knew that the man who was being asked to verify himself was the one person on that plane with the greatest power to decide their future. In just a few more minutes, that truth would come to light, and when it did, everything would flip. The atmosphere in the cabin now felt like the surface of a lake right before a storm, smooth still but hiding a deep undercurrent beneath. Marcus continued standing beside the cabin wall. He wasn't leaning, he wasn't tired. But his stillness, quiet, steady, almost meditative, drew even more attention than anything else. No one believed this was just a technical mix-up anymore. And Marcus's silence, a silence deep as a winter dusk, made people start to wonder, who is he, and why are they treating him like this? Captain Nora Graham stood rigid, her expression hardening as she pressed the internal call button for security. Her movements were sharp, practiced, like someone who'd grown comfortable wielding authority. A soft beep echoed, not loud, but enough for everyone to know the situation had just shifted into a new phase. First Officer Daniel Coleman folded his arms and stepped closer to Marcus. Tall frame, squared shoulders, voice heavy as a command. "Sir, to prevent further disruption to the flight, I ask that you comply with security when they arrive." Calvin Rhodes frowned. "You're calling security on a passenger who's standing exactly where he's supposed to be," Coleman replied without thinking. "We believe there may be an issue with his identity." Linda Harper shot back immediately. "No, you're not questioning his identity. You're questioning him." Her words dropped into the cabin like a stone, into still water, ripples of discomfort spreading outward. Harvey Collins snorted. "Oh, come on. Don't turn this into some moral debate. They're just enforcing standards." Linda turned to him, her eyes calm but cutting sharper than any blade. "Are they enforcing standards, or enforcing whatever bias they've grown used to?" Harvey didn't answer. His jaw tightened. While the tension intensified, Marcus remained silent. He looked down at the boarding pass in his hand, a small piece of paper that had somehow become the center of a much bigger storm. Jenna Price, the young flight attendant, shifted nervously. Her eyes flickered between Nora and Marcus, full of uncertainty. She remembered the training sessions. Passengers come first. Do not judge based on appearance. Respect is non-negotiable. But those words seemed to vanish the moment hierarchy and bias walked in. Jenna bit her lip, then whispered, "Captain, maybe we should check the system again. I just saw his profile change status." Maybe it is a glitch. Nora looked at Jenna as though she'd committed treason. It's not a glitch, the system is accurate. But Jenna tried. Nora cut her off sharply. No buts. I'm responsible for this cabin. I make the decisions. Jenna fell silent. Her eyes dropped. Her fingertips trembled slightly on the edge of her tablet. Marcus saw everything, how people were bent by a system they didn't fully believe in, how subordinates swallowed their doubts to survive chain-of-command culture. He didn't blame Jenna. He felt for her because he had once been exactly where she stood. Evan Lee stepped forward again. I think we're missing something. If he truly wasn't allowed here, then security at the terminal entrance wouldn't have let him in. Calvin nodded. Exactly. This is a private terminal. No one gets in without pre-clearance. A few passengers murmured agreement. Harvey only crossed his arms, chin raised. Coleman glared at Evan. You don't work in aviation. You don't know how serious it is when someone infiltrates a priority area. Evan shot back. Then explain why everyone else walked in without being questioned. Why is he the only one whose financial tier you suddenly need to verify? The question struck like a bolt, straight at the center of the issue. Coleman froze for 2 seconds, then hid behind authority. We're following the system. Don't make assumptions. And then a new presence appeared. Owen Shaw, the private terminal's security officer, stepped inside. Around 37, athletic, build, firm expression without being hostile. He had heard the alert and came immediately. Captain, what's the situation? Owen asked, professional and even-toned. Nora pointed straight at Marcus. This passenger needs further verification. His name isn't on the priority first-class list. Owen looked at Marcus, then tapped his identity scanner on his wrist. A soft chime. 1 second. Then Owen's brows lifted slightly but unmistakably. His information is fully valid, Owen said. Marcus Carter passed all verification checks before entering the terminal. The cabin reacted like someone had plucked a string that had been wound too tight. Calvin exhaled. Evan blinked in relief. Linda smiled small, knowing hopeful. Nora's face tightened. That's impossible. I checked the priority list myself. Owen reviewed the data again. The priority list has nothing to do with a confirmed first-class ticket. He was granted access at 6:12 a.m. by the central system. Coleman interjected quickly. He could be using forged information. Owen shook his head. No. The biometric data matches his real ID. But Nora still grasped at her last defense. His profile doesn't fit our typical priority passengers. Those words, those exact words, made even Owen look at her with disbelief. He responded clearly, firmly. There is no rule that a passenger has to look like any particular tier. Silence fell like snow. You could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system. Harvey cleared his throat. Excuse me, but it's obvious Owen turned to him, voice low and made of iron. Sir, I strongly advise you to stop. Harvey swallowed the rest of his sentence. Jenna looked at Marcus, her eyes full of remorse. I'm sorry. I was just following instructions. Marcus gave her a gentle smile, a smile that nearly brought tears to her eyes. It's all right, I understand. And he truly did. She wasn't the problem. The environment around her was. Losing her composure, Nora raised her voice, something she rarely did. Everyone return to your seats. We will continue verification with central control. Calvin spoke up immediately. No, we're staying right here. Because clearly, the problem isn't him. Linda added softly, Captain, you might want to reflect on how you've handled this. This isn't professionalism anymore. Evan looked at Nora, calm but direct. Sometimes people don't realize they're wrong until too many others can see it. Marcus met Nora's eyes. Not angry, not spiteful, just deep, still, unshakably dignified. Captain, he said gently, voice calm as early morning, you can verify as many times as you want. But there's something you should understand. Real authority isn't shown by who you stop. It's shown by how you treat the people you stop. Nora opened her mouth, but no words came. She had never heard anyone speak to her that way, quietly, respectfully, yet with undeniable truth. Owen stepped toward Marcus. "Sir, you have every right to take your seat in 1A. I'll escort you." Marcus nodded. "Thank you." He walked into first class, slow, steady, not triumphant, just composed. But every step he took echoed through the cabin like the slow beat of a ceremonial drum, because everyone now understood the man they'd tried to block carried a dignity deeper than any uniform rank or title in that cabin. He had still not revealed who he was. He hadn't said a word about his true identity. But in just a few minutes, when the central system finished updating, when the truth came out, when real authority returned to its rightful owner, everything would change. And not just for this flight. The moment Owen Shaw confirmed the very information the crew had tried to deny, the entire first-class cabin seemed to tilt, not physically, but in that invisible way power shifts in a room. Marcus walked toward seat 1A, but he didn't sit down yet. He rested his hand on the back of the seat, feeling the cool, soft leather under his palm. Everyone watched him as if they were waiting for something bigger. A truth. A reversal. Captain Nora Graham stood frozen. She tried to keep her face neutral, but her eyes were no longer as hard as before. There was a faint tremble in them, not fear exactly, but unease. The certainty she'd been standing on had just cracked. Then the chime from the internal communication system sounded, a tiny tone, but Marcus knew that sound would change everything. At AeroVance headquarters, Seattle, Washington, Natalie Torres sat in front of her control screen, fingers moving quickly between data windows. She'd just received a signal from the flight tracking system, flagged passenger Marcus Carter, verification override requested. She stared at that name, and it took her exactly 1 second to understand what was happening. "No way," Natalie whispered. She immediately hit the priority channel, notify executive tier security and internal compliance. A red message flashed onto the screen. Situation detected, possible discrimination under operational authority. This was the protocol. Marcus himself had designed, a system meant to flag any abuse of power during operations. It had never been used before. Until today. Natalie dialed the private number Marcus reserved only for critical situations. The call connected. Weak signal. Then his voice quiet. "This is Marcus." "Marcus?" Natalie's voice shook a little. "HQ just got an alert from your flight." "What's going on?" Marcus glanced around the cabin. Nora stood like a trembling statue. Coleman looked from Marcus to Owen's screen, clearly unable to explain how the system had verified him so quickly. Marcus answered softly, "Just a test. Going exactly the way we expected it might." Natalie took a deep breath. "You want me to activate Protocol 21? Marcus went silent for a few seconds. Every passenger watched him. The cabin felt like a courtroom waiting for a silent judge to speak. Finally, he said, "Turn on full route monitoring and notify the legal team." Natalie nodded even though he couldn't see her. "Got it. Executing now." And just like that, from Seattle to Denver, every system tied to that flight lit up. Back on the plane, Coleman received a notification on his device. He glanced at the screen, then stepped back, just one step, but it spoke volumes. Internal oversight activated. Nora saw the symbol. She knew exactly what it meant. In private aviation, that icon appearing on a flight meant only one thing. There was a suspected serious violation in operations. And from that moment on, everything the crew did would be logged. Every word, every action, every expression. A cold shiver ran down Nora's spine. "What? What is this?" she asked Coleman. He swallowed. "HQ is monitoring this flight, probably because of what just happened." Nora pressed her lips together. She knew this was no longer about verifying a passenger. It had grown beyond her control. Owen Shaw, the only person in this mess who hadn't been pulled into bias, stepped closer to Nora. "Captain, since the passenger's profile is valid, I recommend we end any additional checks." If not, I'll have to file a formal report." His tone wasn't challenging. It was simply the voice of someone doing his job correctly. But to Nora it sounded like someone stripping away the last layer of her authority. "You don't understand the situation," Nora replied, her voice smaller than before. Owen tilted his head. "Then explain it." For the first time since this started, Nora had no answer. Marcus watched her. In his eyes there was no gloating, no need to win. Only the calm of someone who had felt this kind of hurt too many times. He said quietly, "Captain, I don't want anyone to lose their job. I just want to be treated like any other passenger." For a split second, something like guilt flickered in Nora's eyes. Then the cabin speakers crackled to life. AeroVance headquarters, calling Flight AV-117. "Captain Graham, please confirm you're available for communication." The whole cabin tensed. No one had expected HQ to call directly. Coleman whispered under his breath, "They've never done this before." Nora stepped up to the communication screen and tapped to connect. A face appeared, Elena Vaughn. AeroVance's head of legal, known for being firm and completely unforgiving when it came to violations. Her voice came through, sharp as a blade. "Captain Graham, we've received a report of possible discriminatory conduct in your cabin. I need your explanation immediately." The cabin went still. Nora tried to steady herself. "There is a passenger whose profile doesn't match our first-class priority list. I was simply following procedure." Elena stared straight through the screen, eyes cold but clear. "That passenger was validated by our system at 6:12 a.m. Any delay in his access after that point is not procedure." Jenna lowered her head, fingers tightening around her tablet. Calvin glanced at Evan, giving a slight nod as if to say, "Here it comes." Elena continued, "Based on internal audio and video logs, the crew made judgments that were not grounded in actual data. That is a violation of Section 3 of the AeroVance Code of Conduct." Harvey Collins sat up straighter, his face noticeably pale. Then Elena paused just for a moment before dropping the line no one expected. "Additionally, the passenger your crew has been trying to verify is a senior executive of AeroVance on an internal evaluation flight." The cabin exploded in silence, a silence so thick it was as if every sound had been sucked out of the air. Nora's mouth fell open. A senior executive. Coleman backed up another step. "That's impossible," Jenna whispered. It's him." Calvin let out a small smile, the smile of someone who had suspected as much. Linda placed a hand over her chest and exhaled. Harvey went completely white. Marcus remained where he was. He didn't move, didn't smirk, didn't lash out. Just stood there in a silence deeper than before, like the ocean at dusk. Elena's final words cut through the cabin. "And I expect the crew to remember this power is not always visible, but respect must always be." The call ended. The screen went dark. Nora turned toward Marcus. Her eyes trembled. Her voice cracked into pieces. "Sir, I didn't know. I truly..." Marcus lifted his hand slightly, a small gesture but firm. "Captain, I'm not interested in an apology right now." Nora froze. He continued, voice steady, not cold but deep enough to hit the core. "I just want to understand, what made you so sure I didn't belong in this cabin?" Nora looked at him. No words came out. Because every answer she could give would expose exactly what she didn't want to admit. Marcus set his boarding pass down on the side table next to his seat. "You don't have to say it," he said quietly. "I already know." An invisible chill swept through the cabin. Owen Shaw, the only one who'd stood on the right side of this from the beginning, bowed his head slightly toward Marcus. "If you need any form of support, sir, I'll be here." Marcus nodded. "Thank you, Owen." As Calvin passed by, he gave Marcus's shoulder a light squeeze. "You handled this beautifully," he said. Linda offered a warm smile. "I knew it. From the very first minute I knew you weren't just any passenger." Evan murmured, "I'm just glad the truth came out." Mason, the student with the camera, raised a shy thumbs up and whispered, "Man, that was legendary." Marcus chuckled softly, a small, real smile he hadn't felt in a long time. But the story wasn't over, because now that his true role had been revealed, Marcus would have to decide, would he forgive, or would he use this moment to change the system? And that choice would shape the future of AeroVance. The moment Marcus's true identity began to surface, even though he still hadn't said it outright, the first-class cabin felt like a dark room suddenly flooded with light. Not everyone breathed easier. Some felt fear. Some felt guilt. Some felt shaken. But all of them sensed one thing: the truth was reshaping the air. Marcus still hadn't sat down in seat 1A. He stood with one hand resting gently on the headrest, as if he needed one more heartbeat before stepping into the next chapter. Beside him, Owen Shaw remained steady, professional. Yet in his eyes there was something Marcus didn't see from anyone else on the crew that morning: genuine respect. Evan Lee, the young Asian man, took one careful step forward. He kept just enough distance to be polite, but close enough to signal support. You really work for AeroVance?" Evan asked in a low, almost fragile voice, as if afraid to disturb the moment. Marcus offered a soft smile. "I've been with the company for a while now." Evan let out a small, breathy laugh. "You say it like you're just some ordinary office guy." Marcus tilted his head slightly, replying in a gentle tone, "Sometimes." "I wish that's exactly what I could be." His words landed deeper than he intended. Several nearby passengers heard them, and they felt almost instantly the quiet sadness of a man who lived in high places yet was judged from the lowest assumptions. Then Calvin Rhodes walked forward, slow, steady, solid as a foundation. "Marcus," he said, voice deep and warm, "I don't know who you are, but I know this: the way you stood still in the middle of all that noise, that's real strength." Marcus nodded slightly. "Thank you, but I didn't do anything." Calvin smiled. "And because you didn't, the truth showed itself." The sentence settled into the room, true, heavy, irrefutable. Then came Linda Harper, the elderly woman from row 4. She stepped forward with small, careful steps, but her eyes were bright, glowing, almost like a candle pushing back a dark room. "My dear," she said, placing a gentle hand on Marcus's arm, "you've carried too much that you didn't deserve. I could see it in the way you breathe." Marcus blinked. My breathing." Linda nodded, smiling softly. "There are people who carry burdens so long they forget how heavy they are. The way you stood, the way you stayed quiet, it tells a story even when you don't." Marcus's eyes trembled, just a flicker so small only Linda noticed. Evan felt his throat tighten. Calvin clasped his hands together as if witnessing something sacred. Meanwhile, at the front of the cabin, Captain Nora Graham looked like someone who had just walked out of a storm. Gone was her commanding posture. Gone was her iron certainty. She stared at Marcus not as a problem passenger but as someone she suddenly didn't know how to face. First, Officer Coleman stood still, hand resting on the wall strap as if he needed the support. But what he really needed was something else entirely, a justification for his actions, and he had none. Jenna Price, the young flight attendant, was different. She kept her head low, eyes glassy with tears. Not because she had meant harm, but because she finally realized that following someone else's lead was no excuse for hurting a human being. Marcus looked around, not to judge but to understand. He spoke slowly. "I know sometimes you have to make fast decisions. I know the cabin comes with pressure. But there are things that should never be decided by a single glance." Nora opened her mouth and closed it. No words. Jenna wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Coleman stared down at the floor. Owen looked at Marcus and said quietly, "Sir, I think everyone here wants to know what happens next." Marcus exhaled, a breath heavy enough to carry both exhaustion and clarity. "I didn't come on this flight to punish anyone," he said. "I came to see whether the system I helped build was protecting the right people." Calvin asked, concerned, and it didn't. Marcus looked at the wall where the internal oversight alert still blinked. "It's not the system that's wrong," he said softly. "It's how the system is used." The cabin fell absolutely silent. No denial, no excuses. Because everyone knew he was right. Then Mason Clark, the student with the vlog camera, stepped closer. Mr. Marcus," he said shyly, "do you want me to delete the footage? I don't want to get you in trouble." Marcus looked at him with gentle warmth. "No, keep it. Don't post it if you're uncomfortable, but keep it as a reminder that we all need to look a little closer at the world around us." Mason nodded quickly. "I get it." And then, something rare happened on an airplane. Passengers gathered around a man, not because they feared him, not because they were curious, but because they wanted to stand with him. Evan on his left, Calvin on his right, Linda just behind him, Mason a few steps back. No words, just presence. A presence that said, "We're here. We saw it. We won't pretend we didn't." Nora took one hesitant step forward. For perhaps the first time in her years as captain, her chest felt heavy, not with responsibility but with remorse. "Marcus," she whispered. He turned, calm, not angry, not triumphant, just steady. "I'm sorry, Nora," said her voice breaking. "I was wrong." It was a sincere apology, but far too late to undo the harm. Marcus nodded. "I accept your apology, but this doesn't end here." Nora swallowed hard. "I understand," Marcus continued. "This isn't just about me. It's about anyone who steps onto an AeroVance flight looking the way I do today. Anyone who might be judged before they say a word." Jenna cried softly, quiet but real. Calvin stepped forward. "Marcus, what will you do now?" Marcus looked out the cabin window. The early sunlight had started to rise, washing the runway in a thin golden glow. "What I always do," he said. "Ask questions, find answers, and fix what's broken." Linda rested a hand on his shoulder. "You're not just fixing it for yourself, dear." Marcus nodded. "I know." Then ding! The cabin system chimed with a new update. Jenna lifted her tablet. Her eyes widened. "Oh my God," she breathed. Calvin asked, "What is it?" Jenna looked at Marcus, then at Nora, then read aloud. "AeroVance HQ orders Captain Graham and First Officer Coleman to vacate their positions immediately for the duration of the internal investigation. Command will be transferred to the reserve pilot." The cabin fell into a deeper silence than before. You could hear Harvey Collins inhale sharply. Nora stepped back. Coleman froze. Marcus didn't look triumphant. He didn't look proud. He didn't look angry. He looked resigned, as if he had hoped it wouldn't come to this but knew it had to. Owen stepped forward gently. "I'll escort them out per protocol." Marcus nodded. Not out of satisfaction. Out of necessity. He didn't want to ruin anyone, but he needed the system cleaned. As Nora and Coleman left the cabin, the passengers turned their eyes back to Marcus, not with fear, not with pity, but with a quiet admiration. Evan spoke for everyone. "You didn't just change this flight, you changed all of us." Marcus let out a soft breath. "We change it together." And finally, after everything, Marcus sat down in seat 1A. Not as a CEO, not as a man proving a point, but simply as a human being who had earned the right to sit in the seat he had paid for, the seat that always belonged to him. The first-class cabin had gone so quiet it felt like someone had gently closed the door on an entire era. Nora and Coleman were gone, escorted off the plane by Owen to prepare for the investigation. No shouting, no chaos, no cheap drama, just silence. The kind of heavy silence everyone understands instinctively. Something big has just ended. Marcus sat down in seat 1A for the first time that entire morning. Sunlight slid through the cabin window, tracing soft, calm lines along his nose and cheekbones. But in his eyes, there was still movement, like small waves under the surface of a still lake, the look of a man already thinking far beyond this single flight. Calvin Rhodes settled into the row near him, turning slightly to watch Marcus. "You know," Calvin said, voice low and steady, "I always thought stuff like this only happened on the news, not right in front of me." Marcus gave a faint smile. "We like to believe the world's gotten better, until it reminds us there's still a way to go." Calvin sighed, eyes drifting ahead. "But who has the guts to stand up? Not everyone has your position, your voice." Marcus shook his head slowly. "I didn't stand up because I have power. I stood up because sometimes staying silent is the scarier choice." That line hit Calvin like a quiet, heavy truth. He nodded without saying anything else. A few rows back, Evan Lee unlocked his phone just to check the time and froze. His screen was flooded. Dozens of messages, hundreds of comments, more than 40 missed calls. Evan tapped one alert, trending number 4 inches the U.S. Passenger discrimination on AeroVance flight. He swallowed hard. "Marcus," he called softly. Marcus turned. "Yeah," Evan held out his phone, hand slightly shaking. This just blew up." Marcus looked at the screen. For a moment, no one knew what he was thinking. Calvin asked quietly, "You all right?" Marcus closed his eyes for one brief second, then opened them again, voice calm but clear. "I knew this would spread. I just didn't think it would happen this fast." Mason Clark, the student with the vlog camera, hurried up the aisle from the back. "Marcus, man, my video is going crazy. I didn't post anything, but people are already asking if I've got the full clip." Marcus turned to him, his expression softening. "Leave it as it is. Don't upload, don't delete. Just keep it." Mason nodded quickly. "I'll do exactly what you say." From row 4, Linda Harper walked up slowly, clutching her small bag against her chest. She looked at Mason, then at Marcus. "My dear," she said gently, "when the truth shows up, it doesn't wait for anyone to be ready. It just arrives. And then we have to decide what we're going to do with it." Marcus rested his hand on the armrest and nodded. "And sometimes we have to face it head on." Linda smiled, warm but tinged with sadness. "That's right." Near the galley, Jenna Price stood frozen. Her hands were still trembling. From where he sat, Marcus could see the regret in her eyes. Not the kind of regret used to earn quick forgiveness, but the real kind. The kind that comes when someone finally realizes how badly they misstepped. She walked closer and stopped a few paces away. "Marcus," she said quietly, I'm sorry I didn't speak up when I saw things were wrong." Marcus looked at her, no anger, no bitterness. "Not everyone has the courage to push back against the person in charge," he replied. "What matters is what you choose to do from now on." Jenna bowed her head, tears slipping free. "I'll do the right thing. If I still get the chance." Marcus's voice softened. "Everyone gets a chance to do better, Jenna." Those words weren't just for her, they were for everyone on that flight. Suddenly, a sharp, familiar sound rang out from the cabin screens. Bing! Breaking news. The cabin fell silent again. Evan turned his phone so Marcus could see. Calvin glanced at the large screen at the front of the cabin. A headline scrolled across: AeroVance executive involved in possible profiling incident on flagship flight. Then a blurred video clip appeared, footage taken from a passenger's phone. No names. But Marcus's silhouette facing Nora was unmistakable. Calvin murmured, "There it is, the big wave." Evan looked at Mason. Marcus's friend does a day stay. "Hey, was that from you, Mason?" Shook his head, startled. "No, that's not my angle. Someone else filmed that. I only have my own clip." Marcus watched a few seconds of the video, then handed the phone back. He wasn't angry. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't rattled. He just exhaled. "This isn't just my story anymore." Calvin nodded slowly. "Maybe it never was." Farther down the cabin, Harvey Collins sat stiffly, staring at the digital news feed on his seat screen. He'd been the one mentally cheering on the crew earlier. Now he just sat there, jaw tight, hand gripping the armrest. As Linda walked past him, she spoke gently. Sometimes we need to look at the truth and ask if it really matches what we thought when we were angry. Harvey didn't respond, but his knuckles had gone white. Right then, the PA crackled again. Elena Vaughn's voice came through, measured, controlled, firm. This is an announcement to all passengers. AeroVance is reviewing the recent incident under our transparency protocols. We confirm that Flight AV-117 will continue with a replacement flight crew. Your safety and support are fully guaranteed. Thank you for your cooperation, Calvin nodded. They're moving fast. They don't have a choice. This is too big. Evan whispered Marcus, you think they'll reveal who you are? Marcus shook his head. I don't want that. I just want the truth acknowledged. I don't need people to know who I am for that to happen. Linda rested a comforting hand on his shoulder. You've got a very strong heart. Marcus gave a soft, tired smile. It's not that strong. It's just learn to endure more than it should. The mood in the cabin had shifted completely. This wasn't just a case, not just a situation. It was about a real person with real scars, real limits caught in the center of a media storm. Calvin leaned in slightly and asked, Are you scared? Marcus answered honestly, Yes, I am. But I'm more scared of what happens if I stay quiet. That line made Evan Mason and several others grow completely still. They weren't just watching a man who'd been profiled. They were watching someone fight against every painful memory this moment had awakened. A very real battle, very human, very deep. And then, like clockwork, Mason suddenly burst out, Marcus, look at this. He held out his phone. An article headline, AeroVance silent as discrimination video goes viral. Public wants to know who is the quiet passenger. At the bottom, sources say he may be a senior figure within the company. Calvin looked at Marcus. You think? It's time you tell them who you are. Marcus turned toward the window where the pale blue sky stretched out like a story still being written. Too early, he said. Let the truth speak first. I'll speak when it's time. Linda nodded, eyes warm like morning light. That's the choice of a strong person. Marcus glanced back at her. No, that's the choice of someone who's been judged too many times to rush into another judgment. The cabin fell quiet once more, but it was the kind of quiet that carried weight, like the pause right before a big announcement. And that announcement was coming. Because before Marcus could take another deep breath, Jenna's tablet vibrated in her hands. She checked the screen and her face went pale. She turned to Marcus. Marcus, HQ is asking you to prepare for a direct call. The media team wants to broadcast the conversation. Evan blurted out, Wait, like national TV? Jenna nodded, hands still shaking. They want to hear from you. Right now. Marcus closed his eyes. The cabin held its breath. Calvin whispered, You don't have to do this if you don't want to. Marcus opened his eyes, looked around at Evan, at Calvin, at Linda, at Mason, at the quiet faces watching from behind. And he understood. No, he said, standing up. I'm going to speak. Because sometimes the world only changes when a calm voice finally decides to stand up and talk. The cabin fell into a different kind of silence. Not the tense, choking silence from earlier, but the silence of anticipation, of waiting. Waiting for something everyone knew was about to happen, something that would change more than just this flight. Marcus stood in the middle of the aisle, fingers curling slightly, as if he were gathering all the familiar calm inside himself. He'd spoken in front of the executive board. He'd stood on stage in front of thousands during strategy announcements. He'd inspired new hires with his talks about vision and culture. But this time, he wasn't speaking as a polished leader. He was speaking as a man who had just been judged because of how he looked. Jenna held the tablet, her voice still trembling. Marcus. They said all they need is your yes, and they'll patch you in live on national TV. Every major network is watching. Calvin looked at Marcus with the gaze of someone who'd weathered his share of storms. You don't owe them anything, Calvin said quietly. Don't do it just because the world demands it. Marcus turned, looking at Calvin. then at Evan, at Linda, at Mason, and finally at the rest of the passengers. "I'm not speaking because they asked," he said softly. "I'm speaking because it's time." Linda laid a gentle hand on his shoulder, her touch warm like the breath of old memories. "Go on, child," she said. "But remember, you're not here to embody pain. You're here to show how healing begins." Marcus gave a very small smile, the kind that comes from someone who's lived long enough to know that staying calm is sometimes its own form of strength. "Thank you," he said. Jenna tapped the connect button. The tablet buzzed faintly. The AeroVance Global Communications logo appeared. Then, Elena Vaughn's face filled the screen, looking even more serious than before. "Marcus," Elena said, getting straight to the point, "the nation is watching. We need to confirm that you consent to sharing this conversation live." Marcus drew in a long breath. "I consent." "All right." Elena nodded. "The call will go live in 5 seconds. Calvin muttered under his breath, "Man, you're brave." Marcus replied, "This isn't about bravery, it's about necessity." Jenna motioned for everyone to keep quiet. Evan stepped to the side, but his eyes never left Marcus. Mason lifted his phone but didn't hit record. For the first time, he just wanted to witness, not capture. A countdown flashed on Jenna's screen. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The large front screen in the cabin flickered on. The national news logo appeared, followed by a bold lower third live passenger at center of AeroVance scandal speaks out. There was a brief pause, then Marcus's face filled the broadcast. No studio lighting, no makeup, no perfect camera angle, just a calm man standing in the aisle of an airplane. And somehow, that made the moment even more powerful. On the other end, the anchor's voice came through. "We are now live with the passenger involved in the alleged discrimination incident that's gone viral. Sir, can you introduce yourself to the public?" Marcus inhaled lightly, not in panic, but to steady the rhythm of his own story. "My name is Marcus Langston." Several passengers looked up. They knew that wasn't the whole truth yet, but every story starts somewhere. The reporter continued, "Marcus, would you like to talk about what happened on this flight?" Marcus looked straight into the camera, not with anger, not with evasion, but with the kind of raw honesty that feels like early morning light. "I don't want to retell this to accuse anyone," Marcus said. "I want to retell it, so people understand what it feels like to be judged for something that has nothing to do with your ability or your true identity." Evan felt a chill run through him. Calvin drew a slow breath. Linda gave a small nod as if to say, "There. That's it. That's the truth I was hoping you'd speak." Marcus went on. "When I stepped into the first-class cabin, the crew decided I didn't belong there. Not based on data. Not based on procedure. Just based on how I looked," the anchor asked. "And how did that make you feel in that moment?" Marcus dropped his gaze to the floor for a second, then lifted it again, eyes shimmering slightly, as if reflecting memories from far away. "I felt like I disappeared. The whole cabin seemed to tremble, not outwardly but inside everyone's chest. I wasn't furious," he continued. "I've spent my whole life having to prove myself in spaces I had every right to be in. What hurt was this: they didn't need to know who I was to judge me. They just needed to look at me." Behind him, Mason stared down. Evan swallowed hard. Linda placed a hand over her heart. Calvin whispered, "He's speaking for every black man who's ever been through this." But Marcus wasn't done. "There's one thing I want everyone to understand," he said. "I'm not standing here to say I am a victim. I'm standing here to say, this happens to a lot of people, every day." On the HQ feed, Elena's voice came through softly but audible. "Marcus, do you want to reveal your actual role inside the company?" Calvin held his breath. Evan watched Marcus anxiously. Jenna's eyes were wide. This was a turning point. A moment that could shift the entire narrative. Marcus closed his eyes for a few seconds. When he opened them again, his gaze carried a new kind of calm, the calm of someone who had already chosen. I've thought about that, Marcus said, and I think it's time to tell the truth. The cabin fell utterly silent. No movement, no fidgeting. Even the air felt still. Marcus's voice stayed gentle, but it carried enough strength to straighten spines. I'm not just a random passenger. I work for AeroVance, and I'm responsible for the company's safety and internal evaluation systems. Calvin smiled faintly. You've practically said it all now, he murmured. But Marcus wasn't finished. I'm the one who designed the very procedures the crew used today, and used them the wrong way. On the broadcast, the anchor pushed on. Who exactly are you within AeroVance? What is your title? Marcus took a deeper breath. And then, as calmly as if he were describing a quiet afternoon, he said, I am the Chief Operations Architect of AeroVance. I oversee all operational standards, safety protocols, and process design for the company. Mason's jaw dropped. Evan shot to his feet. Calvin let out a stunned laugh. Good Lord, he finally said it. Linda covered her mouth as tears rolled down without effort. Jenna almost collapsed into her jumpseat, shock washing over her. But Marcus kept speaking like a steady river, with an immense current beneath its surface. Today, I wasn't humiliated because of my title. I was humiliated because they didn't think someone who looks like me belongs here. For a moment, the cabin felt weightless. No whispering, no awkward shuffling, no defensive looks, just truth standing in the middle of the aisle. The anchor's tone shifted, more solemn now. Marcus, what do you want to see happen after all this? Marcus stared into the camera, eyes firm but full of humanity. What I want is simple. I want every passenger, no matter their skin color, clothing, or social status, to be treated with dignity. Evan turned away for a second to wipe his eyes. Calvin placed both hands on his knees and exhaled like he was finally releasing a weight he'd carried for years. Linda nodded, as if agreeing with a sentence she'd waited her whole life to hear. Mason looked at Marcus like he was watching a real hero, not the loud, flashy kind, but the kind who stands his ground quietly and does the hardest thing. The anchor spoke again. Marcus Langston, thank you for sharing your story. Marcus bowed his head slightly. Thank you for listening. The connection ended. The cabin screen faded back to the soft blue interface of the plane. For a few seconds no one said a word. Then Calvin placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder. You just shifted the perspective of millions of people, he said. Marcus answered quietly, I only told the truth. Linda smiled. And sometimes the truth is the most powerful thing there is. Mason added in a hushed tone, I think I just watched history happen right in front of me. Marcus looked at him. It's not history, he said gently. It's just a new beginning. And everyone in that cabin knew those weren't just nice words. They were a promise. Right after the live call ended, the aircraft cabin sank into a silence that wasn't shock. It was transition. The kind of quiet that comes when everyone on board knows this moment is going to stay with me for the rest of my life. Marcus settled back into seat 1A again, but this time that seat wasn't a test or a symbol of status or a battleground he had to win. It was just a seat, and he could finally rest in it, simply as a human being. Calvin Rhodes sat diagonally across, leaning slightly toward Marcus, eyes full of depth, almost reverence. You know, Calvin said gently, some people talk a lot and nobody remembers a word. But there are a few who say very little, and the world never forgets. Marcus exhaled, his back sinking into the soft leather. I don't want to be remembered, he replied. I just want to be understood. From row 4, Linda Harper rose and walked forward, placing a light hand on his shoulder like a mother who's watched too many of her children carry burdens they never deserved. You just helped a lot of people understand, she said. Not just understand you, but understand themselves. Marcus looked into her aging, crystal-clear eyes. I just hope this doesn't get twisted, he said quietly. I hope it doesn't turn into some sensational story. Linda smiled softly. The truth doesn't need drama to be powerful, child. It's already powerful. Back a few rows, Mason Clark unlocked his phone. Instantly, the screen exploded with notifications. "Marcus, you have to see this," he blurted, voice trembling with excitement. Marcus turned slightly. Mason held his phone out. On the screen was the homepage of one of the biggest news outlets in the country. The headline read, "Marcus Langston, executive behind AeroVance's safety systems, speaks out on discrimination incident." Below it was a replay of the live call. Next to the video, hundreds of thousands of comments. People weren't obsessing over his title. They were quoting his words, "I felt like I disappeared. I'm not standing here to say I'm a victim. I'm standing here to say, this happens to a lot of people. I just want every passenger to be treated with dignity." Evan listened as Mason read comment after comment, his eyes shimmering. "Marcus, you reminded people what it feels like to simply be human. Not just a passenger, not a ticket number, a person who deserves respect." Marcus bowed his head slightly. "I hope so," he murmured. Suddenly Jenna's tablet chimed. An internal notification from AeroVance HQ. She read it, then looked up at Marcus, confused, almost disbelieving. "Marcus, they want you to prepare for a live virtual meeting with the entire AeroVance leadership team. As soon as this plane lands." Calvin raised his eyebrows. "Well, they're moving fast." Marcus nodded. "This isn't just about PR. This hits trust, the core of what keeps an airline alive. They can't just let it blow over," Linda added. "And they know nobody understands this system better than you do." Evan leaned forward, worry etched across his face. "Are you nervous?" Marcus smiled, a real smile edged with fatigue. "I've been nervous for the last 20 years, Evan. This is just another chapter." Outside, sunlight filtered through thin layers of cloud, painting the runway and the ground below in soft gold. The cabin glowed under that gentle light like a quiet sign that maybe, just maybe, something good was being born out of the storm. Jenna stood in the aisle, clutching her tablet. After a moment's hesitation, she walked up to Marcus. "Marcus," she began quietly, "there's something I want to say before this goes any further." Marcus looked up, waiting. "I was wrong," Jenna said, voice cracking. "I thought if I stayed quiet I'd be safe. But staying quiet in the face of wrong is never safe. I saw how the captain treated you and I didn't step in. I'm sorry." Marcus turned fully toward her, meeting her gaze. "No anger, no bitterness." "Jenna," he said, "you're still here. That means you still have the chance to do what's right. What matters now is what you choose from this point forward." Tears ran down Jenna's cheeks. "I choose to stand on the right side of this." Marcus nodded, his smile warm. "Then you've already started." From a few rows back, Mason called out, "Marcus, the clip of your live call just passed 20 million views." Evan almost dropped his phone. 20 million? Already? Calvin chuckled under his breath. "You might want to get used to people knowing your name, Marcus." Marcus sighed softly. "I just hope they remember what I said more than who I am." Linda's weathered but warm hand rested again on his arm. "You don't get to control how people remember you," she said. "You only get to control what you leave behind." Marcus sat there quietly. His face reflected not just this moment but all the years that led him here. Outside, the cabin engines hummed as the aircraft prepared to continue its journey with a new crew. Inside, everything felt calmer. But beneath that calm, something new was taking shape, like puzzle pieces finally sliding into place. Calvin leaned in and said softly, "You know, I think this is going to change the whole aviation industry." Marcus tilted his head. "It'll only change if people want to change," he replied. Evan leaned over the seat in front of him. "Do you think AeroVance will really follow through?" Marcus looked out the window, watching ground vehicles move and technicians check the nose of the jet. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I know one thing, they can't pretend they didn't see this." Linda added her voice, gentle yet firm. "And they can't say they got the wrong guy anymore." The cabin burst into a small wave of laughter, soft, but enough to scatter the last pieces of tension. Then Evan's phone buzzed non-stop. He checked it, and his eyes went wide. "Marcus, listen to this. AeroVance's CEO just released a public statement. The company officially apologized. And they mentioned you by name." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Me? What did they say?" Evan read aloud. "We apologize for the experience that passenger Marcus Langston endured. We fully support the statements he made in his live interview. This incident will mark the beginning of a comprehensive overhaul of AeroVance's operational systems and training programs." Calvin let out a low whistle. "Looks like they understand how serious this is." Linda nodded. "They don't have any other choice." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. Those words were both a weight and a release. He opened his eyes and said quietly, "So, it begins. For real this time." Around the cabin, people started talking again. Not whispering, not gossiping, but sharing, relating, reflecting. A man from row 3 stepped forward. "Marcus, I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "I've never seen anyone say out loud what I've been thinking for years." A Latina woman from row 2 added, "You showed us something a lot of people have been too afraid to shout or even whisper." A young white passenger spoke up gently. "My best friend is black. I've watched him get judged for no reason, but I never understood how deep it cut. Not like I do now." Marcus smiled at them all. "Thank you for listening," he said. "That means more than you realize." Then Jenna glanced down at a new notification from HQ. She swallowed. "Marcus, they want to speak with you privately once we land. The full leadership team. They want you to lead a new reform initiative." Evan jumped up. "You have to do it," Calvin laughed. "It's not every day someone asks you to help change an entire company." Linda squeezed Marcus's hand. "You can do this." Marcus stayed quiet for a moment. Not because he was unsure, but because he understood what this would mean. If he said yes, his life would change direction. If he said no, the pain of people like him would still knock on his door one way or another. He looked around at every face watching him. Then he said, "I'll talk to them, but I'm not doing it alone." Calvin asked, "What do you mean?" Marcus's smile this time was genuine, bright in a way it hadn't been all morning. "I'll do it," he said, "if people like me have a voice in the room." Mason shot his hand into the air. "I volunteer." The cabin broke into laughter again. Marcus added, "And if AeroVance truly wants change, they'll understand exactly what that means." He leaned back, eyes turning toward the clear sky outside. "Because a fair system," he said softly, "is never built by one person. It's built from thousands of small stories, just like today." In that moment the cabin went quiet once more, but this time it was the silence of hope, a hope that felt human, real, and very, very close. The new engines hummed with a smoother, softer sound as the replacement flight crew settled into the cockpit. Noon sunlight spilled through the cabin windows, brightening the space in a gentle, steady way. On the surface it felt like the tension had finally faded. But in truth, the real story was just beginning to open its second door. Marcus remained in seat 1A, the light falling softly across his face. But behind that calm expression something heavier sat in his eyes, not just fatigue but a sense like his instincts were whispering that there was still one more truth waiting in the dark. Jenna walked down the aisle holding her tablet with both hands. She slowed as she approached, glancing from Marcus to Calvin, then back again. Finally she spoke, voice low, "Marcus, there's something I need to show you." Marcus looked up. "All right, go ahead." Jenna stared at the screen for a moment, hesitating. "There are old reports," she said. "Complaints from passengers about Captain Nora Graham and First Officer Coleman. But all of them are tagged as resolved. The system doesn't keep the originals, only edited versions." Calvin frowned. "You're saying someone covered them up?" Jenna swallowed. "Not just covered up. Those records were locked. Other departments had their access revoked. Like it all never happened." Evan whispered Jesus. Linda stepped closer and placed a hand gently on Jenna's shoulder. "Say it all, dear," she encouraged. "Don't hold back now." Jenna gripped the tablet tighter, her voice shaking. "There've been at least 8 cases in the last 2 years. They all look the same. Black or brown passengers forced into extra verification, moved from their seats, even denied boarding. The captain always wrote, 'Passenger non-compliant.' But the camera footage shows they didn't do anything wrong." The cabin fell silent like a giant heart had stopped for a single beat. Marcus straightened, eyes fixed on Jenna. "Can you give an example?" Jenna scrolled quickly. "I shouldn't even be able to see these," she said. But when HQ activated internal oversight, the system temporarily unlocked more access for low-level accounts. Calvin crossed his arms. "The system only does that when there's suspicion of a serious violation." Marcus nodded slightly, expression darkening in thought. Jenna read from the screen, Case 1, male passenger 47, business owner. Removed from first class for priority profile mismatch. Cameras confirmed he cleared every security checkpoint and scanned correctly at the gate. She glanced at Marcus, then continued, Case 4, female 29, schoolteacher. Asked to show a bank statement to prove she could afford a first-class ticket. Evan burst out. "What? A bank statement on a plane? Who does that?" Calvin shook his head, voice heavy. "That's not in any airline procedure, ever." Jenna went on, her voice tightening, and the last case was a 14-year-old boy traveling with his aunt. They were moved out of first class because the captain noted, "Adder, not appropriate for premium cabin." But video shows the kid wearing a button-up shirt and khakis. Linda's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling. "My son was once kicked out of a parent conference because they thought I was the nanny. I know exactly how that feels." Marcus looked over at her, and something in his gaze grew even deeper, as if he was hearing the echo of wounds that never really closed. Everyone had thought the truth they'd seen today was already heavy enough. But Jenna still wasn't done. "Marcus," she whispered, "there's one more report." It wasn't filed through the official AeroVance system. It came from a technician's private account. The file was deleted from the main system, but not fully wiped from the memory cache. Calvin's eyes widened. "You restored it?" Jenna nodded, voice cracking. "It says, if no one checks this within the next year, I think a passenger is going to get seriously hurt. Not just their feelings." The cabin temperature seemed to drop. Marcus leaned forward. "They didn't specify what exactly." Jenna shook her head. "No. But the last lines are pretty disturbing." She handed the tablet to Marcus. The final sentence read, "Captain Graham increasingly views certain passengers as risk. I'm afraid this is going to escalate." Evan took a step back. "So, people knew, and they stayed quiet." Jenna lowered her eyes, voice dim. It was all dismissed. No investigations, no follow-up, just buried. Linda clenched her hand around the edge of her cardigan. "That's not a mistake anymore," she said softly. "That's a cycle, a pattern that was fed and protected." Marcus leaned back into his seat, staring past the cabin ceiling as if searching old memories on invisible walls. "I always had a feeling something was off in the system," he said quietly. "I just never imagined it ran this deep." Calvin turned toward him. "You're not responsible for what they did, Marcus." Marcus looked back at him, his voice dropping lower. "But I am responsible for the system I helped design. The system that was supposed to protect people from unfair treatment, and instead got used to hide it. No one cut in with, 'It's not your fault.' Because sometimes pain doesn't need to be softened. It needs to be acknowledged." Marcus took a slow breath, his eyes hardening with resolve. "I'm not letting this continue," he said. Right then Jenna's tablet buzzed again. She checked it and her eyes flew wide. Marcus HQ just sent an urgent update. Calvin stood up. "What now?" Jenna read aloud. "AeroVance Internal Affairs has confirmed evidence of tampering, deletion, and alteration of passenger records over a period of at least 18 months. The former flight crew is currently being detained for further questioning." Evan muttered. "This is way bigger than any of us thought." Jenna scrolled. "They want you, Marcus," she said. "HQ is calling for an emergency leadership meeting the moment we land. You're listed as the primary presenter on procedural violations and your recommendations for reform." Linda smiled faintly, a mix of sorrow and hope. "They trust you now." Marcus nodded slowly, but his voice felt heavier. "They trust me because they have to. And I have to come up with solutions, not just for AeroVance, but for every person who never had the mic I had today." Calvin said softly, "You've said what needed to be said. Now it's time to do what needs to be done." Marcus closed his eyes, not to escape but to gather. To gather all the old hurts, all the silent moments, all the times he'd been judged, dismissed, cut short into a single breath. When he opened them again, his gaze was sharper, clearer. "I'll do it," he said, "but this time, I'm taking it all the way." Evan placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly. Mason shot his hand up like a kid volunteering in class. "Yeah, I'm here too." Linda rested her hand on Marcus's. "You don't have to fix everything for everyone," she said. "You just have to do your part, and others will follow." Calvin chuckled. "The world changes from little flights like this one." The cabin erupted in soft laughter, not loud but healing. Then Jenna's voice softened again. "There is one more thing, Marcus." He turned. "What is it?" She swallowed and handed him the tablet. "This is the last file. The technician's final note. I think you need to see it." Marcus tapped the screen. A final line appeared. "If anyone can change this, it'll be someone who understands the system but walks through life with a heart, not just authority." Calvin read it over his shoulder and whispered, "That sentence sounds like it was written about you." Marcus stared at the words for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not the tired smile from earlier, but something deeper. "It's not written about me," he said softly. "It's written for anyone brave enough to stand up." The cabin grew quiet again. But these silences weren't heavy anymore. They were full of something new. Hope. The plane began to taxi. Passengers buckled in, preparing for the rest of the journey. And Marcus, the man who had once been told, even without words, that he didn't belong in his own seat, was now preparing to take a very different one. The seat at the center of change. The flight hadn't even left the ground. But the story had already gone farther than anyone imagined. The aircraft began to decelerate, tilting gently as it descended toward the runway. The afternoon sun cast a soft gold sheen across the metallic skin of the AeroVance jet. No one inside the cabin said a word, because sometimes words only dilute a moment that's meant to be felt, not explained. Marcus looked out the window, watching the runway stretch ahead, long, straight, like the timeline of everything he'd carried to this point. What he felt wasn't triumph. It was a kind of quiet relief, like finally setting down an old, heavy suitcase he'd been carrying far too long. As the plane slowed, Linda Harper leaned toward him and whispered, "Son, we finally made it to the ground." Marcus nodded, a faint smile forming. "Yes, ma'am. But I think the real journey is just about to start." Linda chuckled softly. "That's life, isn't it?" The seatbelt sign went off. Latches clicked, but no one got up. The cabin stayed still, almost reverent, as if everyone needed one more breath to take in what they had all just lived through. Then Evan Lee tapped Marcus lightly on the shoulder. "Hey, you ready? It's probably crazy out there." Marcus frowned slightly. "Crazy? What do you mean, Mason?" Clark lifted his phone, turning the screen toward him. "See for yourself." On the display, dozens of news networks were live streaming the arrival. Outside the private terminal, hundreds of reporters stood packed shoulder to shoulder. Camera lights flashed like a sea of artificial stars. Every outlet carried the same headline: Flight AV-117 lands. Marcus Langston expected to speak. Marcus exhaled, slowly rubbing the bridge of his nose. This is exactly what I used to fear." Calvin placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You're not walking out there alone." Evan nodded firmly. "Yeah, we're with you." Mason raised his hand. "Me too." Soft laughter rippled through the cabin, relieving just a bit of the pressure swirling around Marcus. A soft click came from the front. A flight attendant from the replacement crew pulled open the cabin door. Light from the terminal spilled inside, and with it, a wave of sound. Not boos, not outrage, but cheers. Real, earnest, rising cheers. As Marcus approached the threshold, the noise swelled like surf crashing against the shore. People called out, "Marcus Langston, we stand with you. You spoke for all of us." Marcus paused for a heartbeat. His chest tightened, not from panic but from something new, something unfamiliar. He wasn't used to being welcomed like this. Calvin stepped beside him, whispering, "You're not just somebody who lived the story, Marcus. You're the voice of it." Evan smiled gently. "Let's go. The world's waiting." Marcus stepped down the stairs slowly. Flashbulbs burst around him like streaks of white lightning. A reporter extended a microphone his way. "Marcus, do you have a message for the country about what happened on this flight?" He stopped. He didn't look at the cameras. Instead, he turned toward the passengers of AV 117, the people who'd witnessed everything, the people who'd stood beside him. And then he spoke, voice steady, calm, but carrying power far beyond volume. "I don't want today's story to be about me. I want it to be about something we've forgotten, that every human being has dignity." The crowd fell silent for one long beat. And then microphones angled forward like sunflowers turning toward the light. Marcus continued, "I didn't stand up today because I'm special. I stood up because too many people don't get the chance to be heard. Today I was simply one of them." Behind him, Evan's lips parted in awe. Linda placed a trembling hand over her heart. Calvin nodded, pride shaping his expression. Marcus kept speaking slower now. "We can't change the world in a single day. But we can start by not judging people based on how they look. We can start by seeing each other through human eyes." A woman in the crowd began to cry. A man lifted his fist in quiet solidarity. Marcus bowed his head gently. "I'll work with AeroVance to reform what needs reforming. But the biggest changes won't come from the company. They'll come from each of us." Then he stepped back, letting the applause crash over him like a warm tide. Moments later, Marcus was guided into a temporary conference room inside the private terminal. On a large screen, the board of AeroVance was already waiting. CEO Henry Whitford, silver hair, sharp gaze softened by something sincere, stared at Marcus for several seconds before speaking. "Marcus, we owe you an apology." Marcus shook his head. "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for solutions." Henry exhaled, nodding in agreement. "We want you to lead the reform initiative. Not as a systems architect, but as someone who's lived what we clearly failed to see." Marcus narrowed his eyes slightly. "What exactly are you asking for?" Henry answered bluntly. "Rewrite every operational procedure from the perspective of someone who's been treated unfairly, and build a new oversight group to ensure this never happens again." Calvin, Evan, and Mason stood behind Marcus, holding their breath. Linda smiled, a soft, knowing smile, as if she'd already seen the answer coming. Marcus took a few seconds. Then he replied, "I'll do it, but I have conditions." Henry leaned forward. "Name them." Marcus looked straight at the camera, his expression resolute. "I won't do this alone. I want people like me, people who've been overlooked, to have seats on that committee." Henry blinked, surprised. But then a slow smile crossed his face. "Not only acceptable, it's the right thing to do." Marcus nodded once. "Then let's begin." When the call ended, Marcus stepped out of the room. Evan rushed in first. "You did it, Marcus, you did it." Mason threw both hands in the air. "You just rewrote the future, man." Calvin grinned and clapped him on the back. "You opened a door people have been knocking on for decades." Linda pressed a hand over her heart. "And you did it with the gentlest strength I've ever seen." Marcus looked at them, each face, each smile, each person who had shared that unforgettable flight, and he said, It wasn't me. It was all of us. For a moment no one spoke. Then soft laughter bubbled through the room, warm, human healing. Before they left the terminal, Marcus turned to look at the AeroVance jet resting quietly on the tarmac. It wasn't the sight of his humiliation anymore. It had become a symbol of something else entirely. Evan asked quietly, "How much do you think this will change?" Marcus replied, "Maybe not everything, and maybe not overnight, but it'll change the people who were on that flight, and that's enough to start something real." Linda took Marcus's hand. "You know, today you didn't just take back your seat. You gave a seat back to so many others." Marcus looked at her eyes, soft but steady. "Maybe that's the real journey. This story doesn't end with engines roaring back to life, or applause filling the cabin. It ends with the image of a black man standing in the glow of terminal lights, finally facing a world where he doesn't walk alone. Because sometimes the movement that shakes a whole system begins the moment one person refuses to be pushed out of the seat that was theirs from the start."